Hey, Heather.
Good morning, John.
Good morning. Yeah, I like the new view.
Hey, I don't
Yeah,
know if you can.
are those different bottles of beer on the shelf back there?
Oh, back there? No, not beer. That's grains up on the shelf, and
Okay. Yeah, that's a nice substitute.
it is a nice substitute. And I have up here all my favorite jazz musicians.
Oh, wow. Like who?
Oh, there's like Duke Ellington and Dizzy Gillespie, Abby Lincoln.
Miles Davis.
No, he's not up there actually.
Ah,
I didn't have a photo of his. Milt Jackson, Elvin Jones on drums. Yeah,
oh,
some great musicians.
into jazz. That's great.
Yeah, I had my grandfather who was really into Duke Ellington, and then my dad was really into Paul Desmond. And then I fell in love with a boy in Turkey who was really into Stan Getz, and that genre of jazz is my favorite.
Yeah.
West Coast bossa nova sound.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
You like
So
that?
you say your grandfather was into that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh,
He
well, that's
did some
pretty cool.
recordings. Yeah.
You're just all over the place with music, aren't you?
I kind of am. Yeah. Yeah. What do you like to listen to?
Mostly classic rock, but it all depends on what time of the day.
Mm.
Spa, easy stuff in the morning, and then I crank it up later on. But
And this one.
also classic country.
Ooh, like
Um,
who?
Hank Williams.
Oh yeah.
My gosh, take it all the way back. And
Mm-hmm.
then a lot of good guys in the 70s. Also listen to classic music, classical music.
Mm-hmm.
My grandma got me into that.
Is there a particular composer that resonates with you?
Bach,
Mm.
Mozart, the big guys. Um, on PBR, they used to have, they'd play a segment, a piece of music, and you were to guess the piece and the artist. And when I first moved up here, there was only like 3 radio stations that I could listen to, and PBR was one of them. And I was getting to the point where I could guess a couple of them. Never thought I'd be there, but yeah.
It's difficult, I think. Until you really listen long and listen hard,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
someone kind of helps to teach you what their sound is like and how it differentiates from their contemporaries.
Oh gosh, yeah. Yeah.
All right. I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Let's see. Kara and Amanda, are you both ready to go?
I'm good.
I am ready.
Great. So we can go ahead and get started. I can't get the agenda to load, so I'm going to be flying blind here. I think I know what we're doing. Does anyone have the agenda up, and let me know, can you let me know if we have any minutes to approve?
I don't see any minutes attached.
Okay.
I thought that I did see some minutes. Oh, hold on. Land use and planning minutes, October 14th, 2020.
Okay.
Oh, you're right. Sorry, I didn't click down far enough.
No, that's okay. So I'm just going to go on screen order here for roll. Let's see. It looks like we have all members present except Ms. Becerra is not with us yet, but I think she'll be in. So we have everyone here except Mirta. We have minutes to approve from October 14th. Are there changes to those? All right, seeing none. Is there public comment on any items not listed on the agenda? Oh, Sandra, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I just copied and pasted the agenda and emailed it to you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so seeing no public comment, just so everyone's aware, if you haven't attended one of our webinar meetings, you can use the hand raise function in Zoom to add comment. We do have some folks here like from Dover Cole, so I'm going to be promoting people into the meeting as needed. If you need to share your screen or participate with video, feel free to raise your hand. I'll start promoting folks into the meeting as panelists as well. We have, and I'll just be monitoring for public comment throughout the meeting. So feel free to raise your hand or press *9 if you're joining by phone. We have just one agenda item today, and I'm really excited about this agenda item. This is an introduction on form-based code. The MULLAN Area Master Plan utilizes form-based code, which is a type of zoning that is not utilized yet in Missoula, but I think has some real potential. And we have Tom Zavitz here from Development Services, as well as other Development Services staff, and then we have a team from Dover Cole here to present as well. And I think what I'd do is turn it over to Tom, and then Tom, let you introduce the topic and the presenters.
Okay, thanks, Jordan. This is Tom Zavitz with Development Services, City of Missoula, and I'm a senior planner. I have Dover Cole here, who has been the consultant or lead consultant on the MULLAN Area Master Planning project, and we're going to be presenting a public hearing on December 7th. But ahead of that, because there's so much information here for you all to digest, I wanted to have Dover Cole give us all really a primer on form-based code, which is what they are proposing that we use in that MULLAN area. And the master plan itself, which goes along with the code, is a separate item. And if you haven't already heard about that in a presentation, you will hear about that more as we lead up to December 7th. But today was mainly set up to get us familiar with what a form-based code is and what it is intended to do. And I'm going to give you a little bit of that in a nutshell right here, which is that when we talk about a form-based code, we say it's a new thing. But what it is attempting to do is get us back to a traditional neighborhood type of design that maybe we saw around 100 years ago. And, you know, Andrew Hagemeyer is here with us also. He's the county's project manager on this. And he always likes to say, you know, my best example is think of the Orange Street Food Farm and think of the neighborhood around that. And that developed both before our zoning code and after, and it has little pieces of different kinds of zones in it, but it isn't all one zone. And our present zoning code really doesn't allow us to get to development like that. And so that's where this form-based code comes in. And that code, this type of code, although that looks complicated on the outside, is not so much. And I think you'll see that. And will help us to allow development to occur in that way without being totally prescriptive, but being somewhat prescriptive. So I don't want to say anything more than that. Jason King and Rob Pietkowski from Dover Coal can explain it a lot better than I can. And I'm going to just go ahead and hand it over to Jason and Rob right now. And I'm not sure if they need any screen sharing. Looks like they may have that. So Jason, if you want to take it. And well, let me add one last thing. We were at planning board last night and they recommended adoption of the plan and code to both the city and county. So that was a big step forward for us. They made some changes and amendments, but you'll see those in time. And okay, back to Jason.
So before that, I think we have, I believe, a public hearing in mid-December. Is that to adopt the plan at the city and county? Is that correct, Tom?
Yeah, I think we're going to have a joint hearing with the county commissioners and the city council on Monday night, December 7th. Great.
And then Jason, what's your preference as far as questions? Do you want to just take questions as we go, or do you want to stop for questions do you want to wait till the end or stop for questions along the way?
I think questions as we go, and then we have, I think, 3 sections here. In between them, we'll also give people a chance to talk.
Great. So if anyone has questions, just raise your hand and I'll recognize you. And Jason and Rob, we'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So my name is Jason King with Dover Coal Partners. I've been the project director, working very closely with Rob and a multidisciplinary team, including Territorial Landworks and Jacobs. Those are both local offices. One of the things that came out of last night's meeting was that the name of this project might change, but right now the name of the project is the MULLAN Area Neighborhoods. And so we're going to go through the plan and go through the code, and then yeah, able to take questions as we go. So the plan is the vision. That's that involves a lot of renderings and text and maps and description of public process, and then the code is the regulations. And we've made it as illustrative as possible, but it's the law. And so there's less, images and diagrams. But nevertheless, we worked to make it as easy to understand as possible. And so I'll explain sort of the master plan quickly, and then we'll go into the form-based code. And Rob, I think most people on this call have heard some version of this presentation. So we'll move fast through some images. Now, form-based coding. Form-based coding creates places like this, what you see on the screen. And this kind of sums up the project. This is West Broadway Square. This means that there would be an area that would be denser, and there'd be taller structures, and there would be a square, a logical center. It would be right off of West Broadway, in the interior of the site. And it's taller, it's compact, it's walkable, it's mixed use. Now, this is the image that we created during the charrette, and a lot of people commented on it. And we've been working on this project for about a year now. And it felt helpful to update this, because after 1 year of meetings and a lot of input, I feel like the vision is still on track. If you look at the building here with the shed roof, the V roof, and you look at the building on the left with the tower, I asked James Doherty, our director of design, to create another rendering. This rendering shows that same square with a lot more detail. After a lot of pushing and pulling, environmentalists, neighbors, I feel like this is still very, very much possible. And so what is it? It's a place that looks like, as Tom mentioned, it looks like it was built about 100 years ago when things were built together, vertically and in a mixed way. And right now, nothing in this image would be allowed at all under the existing code. And I can't guarantee that you will get just this, or that there will be this many dogs when it comes time for the fire pit. But, and things never look exactly like the rendering, ever in the history of planning. We talk about the plan of Chicago in 1908, filled with renderings. Nothing ever looked exactly like they drew. And that's the most successful of American plans. But something closer to this will come of it than otherwise. We're making it possible, and we're incentivizing it. And it's a place for people to be, and it's a spot that people would enjoy. And it's also, and you have mixed feelings when you see an image like this, because no one moved to Montana in order to live in a situation like this, to be honest. But you're building densely here so that way you're not building, so that way you're not sprawling elsewhere. You don't have an inexhaustible supply. I know it feels like you do, but you don't, of people coming to Missoula. You can satisfy 50 years of that supply in one place. You're not, you know, San Francisco or Los Angeles. You can build densely and expect that it means you won't have to build. You will have relieved the development pressure in other places. And if you're going to build densely, build with design, build a place that people like. And that's, I think that's what this image shows. And there's even a snowman. Our work builds upon all the conversations that you've been having in the past, you know. And we took this project because you really set the framework. You made it easy, you teed it up for us. And whether it's the city's growth policy or the county's growth policy, and we'll look at them in just a second, the people said, build here, you know, it's not on the mountains, it's not on a ridge. Build here, it's the valley floor and it's flat and it's grazed, and you can build densely, you know. It's in a kind of a valley, so it isn't the most visible thing. So for environmental reasons and for social reasons, for economic reasons, build in this spot, and that's what we set out to do. So just bring everybody up to speed. You know where the project is, just south of the airport, between West Broadway and Mullan. It's an area of emerging neighborhoods. If we do nothing, it's going to be 3 unit per acre houses. You get about 120 houses, and that's it. It'll be developed, but it won't help satisfy affordable housing or environmental or social justice concerns. It'll just be a bunch of expensive houses. You know that this project was compelled in a lot of ways by the Build Grant, federal grant, money to build large streets and stream restoration and build trails. That's coming. The big streets are coming. And so the question is, what's it going to look like in between them? The Missoula growth policy, the county plan said average density, 15 units to the acre. It said all roads need to be multimodal, and it said to mix uses. And they put a big purple spot, you know, red is for commercial and yellow is for housing and green is for protected. Well, purple puts all those colors together and it means mix. And right there in the land use element, it talks about build here in these little purple spots on the left. So that way you can relieve some of the development pressure in the places where there are not people and there shouldn't be people, but are still entirely buildable. Less is protected, I've come to realize, than we all think. And so this project. And it feels like it's far away, but it's not. It's only 4 to 6 miles, depending on how you count it, from the downtown. This could be a downtown neighborhood in one way. So we're all about the downtown, and we don't want to do anything that interferes with the downtown becoming everything. And Higgins Avenue is one of the best main streets in the world. I've come to really understand, and having known it now for a couple of years. But it needs a residential population. It needs people that can get down there in order to keep it busy and thriving. And so just you know, imagine this as a new downtown neighborhood, connected by transit, connected by bike infrastructure, and it's a spot to put all the houses because the downtown right now is filling fast, and I believe it could be complementary. Every growth projection of the county shows a 50% growth, between 50 and 75% growth. You know, you look at Google Maps, you can see that the valley floor is being consumed by, at the moment, low density suburban development and drive-only suburban commercial. And you know that one of the issues that's happening is that it's getting harder and harder to afford. It's getting harder and harder to afford rents. If it's a business, it's getting harder and harder to afford houses. And people in Missoula are just settling for a lower and lower quality of life, for more and more of their income going toward, you know, not sending their kids to college or taking a vacation to Florida or what have you. They're accepting that more and more of their income is just going to have to go to housing in order to be there. And there's a lot of different approaches to affordable housing, and the code talks about that. But the main one is you satisfy supply, and that stabilizes prices. In your market, it would stabilize prices. and then the next group of people that are buying or renting won't have to spend as much in order to be in Missoula. That's the idea. So our public process began in January. We had a charrette in March, virtual charrette. We've done a series of meetings, and many of you were in those meetings. We're headed toward plan adoption. You know, we did a virtual charrette March 23rd to 27th, right at the beginning of the pandemic. Our process has been emulated, it's been described by Smart Growth America, the National Charrette Institute, American Planning Association. You did the first virtual charrette the world has seen, and now I get calls about it and asked about it all the time because it was successful. We had studio where people could talk to thoughtful, intelligent people like Rob and Allie. We had stakeholder meetings, talking to everyone. It was all open to the public, from the property owners to Parks and Recreation, for instance. We created 26 different films, and people, astonishingly, there are people who have watched them all. And so maximum possible access. You know what we were thinking. You know why we drew what we drew. And those films have been watched. There's over 5,000 views of those little amateur shoddy films that we made, but still help people understand why and what. Now, you can still talk to us through the poll questions and the surveys and the online mapping. All of that is still active. We did, it wasn't enough, the virtual. So we did the, Tom and Andrew especially, and many of you did the workshop in July outside, socially distanced, wearing masks. That image on the right is now on the American Planning Association website, because it's just a great image. It's got mountains and dogs, and honestly, everyone's trying to do what we were able to accomplish. I'll just skip ahead here. It was an experiment, and the question was, you know, is this really is this a valid way to engage the public on such an important topic? We talked to a lot more people than we would have otherwise live. And there was a wider variety of people, older, younger, busy professionals, landowners, some living in Seattle, city council people, county council people, you know, like who are on the call today. And we were in the news. It was easy for them to write articles because everything was available virtually. So the total involvement has been terrific. And the plan has changed quite a bit since the first charrette. The draft plan now, the 9/11, I guess regrettably, the 9/11 draft is the one that's the most, is the one that's available on the website. People are able to put comments on there. The bottom line is that this site would be 6,000 new units, variety of different unit types for a variety of people, 5 walkable centers, potentially over 6 miles of trails, restored Grant Creek, and farming in a variety of ways. We found especially a good spot for community-supported agriculture. And everything breaks down according to the 5-minute walk or the 10-minute walk. These are complete neighborhoods, and it would be a good addition, I think, to the urban fabric of the city. And the big ideas are still the big ideas. New development should be compact, respectful of context, and build great places. Connect with agriculture, parks, and Grant Creek. Build sustainably, safe, comfortable, interesting streets for everyone. And then decide what you want and create a clear path for getting there. And that's the code. The code is, after the conversation, what is it you want to see? Turn that into law and streamline, expedite, and make easy that development, you know. And so it's law, but it has diagrams, and it's got pictures. It draws very heavily from the downtown Missoula, really, precedent, the historic precedent. Everyone knows downtown Missoula. You know, it's possible to build structures like that. This is never going to compete with the downtown. The downtown is absolutely unique, 150, 200-year history. It'll never, nothing we build new is ever going to be as grand, you know. There's so many more beautiful old structures to protect than we will ever be able to build new. You know, this won't compete with the downtown. Even our best images of new built structures, it never is the downtown. So I wouldn't worry about it competing. But instead of the laissez-faire conventional approach. The form-based code is the method of regulating development to achieve a specific development form and predictable public realm. We'll move quick. The bottom line with form-based coding is that all codes, all zoning, all subdivision regulations, they're interested in form, density, and use and the management, the administration of the code. And in your most conventional uses, their prime concern is use and density. They were created about 100 years ago to keep everything separated, and form is a very small part of it. And that created 100 years of American placelessness and places that don't really look like anything. And now the new codes are much, much more heavily emphasis on form and placemaking. And that's the bottom line with the form-based code in two images. Use and density are still there, but a lot less important. And form becomes the primary thing that you concern yourself with. So, on the left is conventional development. On the right is an area, it's Winter Garden. It was built under form-based code that we wrote. On the left is conventional suburban development. And on the right is a new community, Puluahua in Hawaii, under a form-based code. Just really quick, these new communities happen all the time at this point. Not every time, but the best we can do is make it possible. Like Serenbe, they've got a new main street. Structures look nice. They look like they've been there for a long time. But obviously, look, that doesn't look like the downtown. It doesn't look like Higgins. It's never going to compete. But it's nice. It's brick. It's walkable. It's Main Street buildings. There are, in every case, a small Main Street. There's attached units. We've got something like 35% attached units as part of this project. And then there's single family houses. And by virtue of building densely in one area, there's the ability to preserve other areas. And these are places with much lower household median incomes, and they're nevertheless able to, like Montgomery, they're able to achieve something quite grand by using these codes. And this is all new construction. It's all construction that we've in one way or another been part of. And this is also economic development, right? Younger people are less interested in the suburbs of their parents and grandparents. They want urban, they want to know each other, they want gathering places. They're okay in smaller spaces on smaller lots, as long as they're able to get outside and meet and enjoy quality of place. And so this is also about keeping the kids that you're educating and helping turn them into residents and entrepreneurs and contributors. We'll talk more about the transect. The bottom line is everyone gets bored by 6 square miles of just houses or 6 square miles of just shopping. And it's about diversity. Within a 5-minute walk, there's main streets, and there's attached living, and there's single family houses, and there's a countryside that you can get out to and take a breath. And it's all within a 5-minute or 10-minute walk. And that experience keeps people walking because they need something different. All right, well, that's the overview. Rob is our, we've all been working on this code, but I'm going to pass this over to Rob Piatowski because he's been working on the code with Tom and Andrew the most specifically. And while I'm going to stop share here, and Rob is going to put up his slides. Now this is a good spot to talk and to have questions. What questions do you have at this point?
Okay, questions before we move on? Heather.
Sorry, not so much a question, but just a notation if you're willing to take that, Jason.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Your comment about how our younger generations today are looking for a type of building form, if you will. It may not be their grandparents' generation. I think it goes back a couple generations further back where they were actually going back to where we were maybe 150, 200 years ago.
This is Tom. Could I add on to that, Heather, and to what Jason said, when we did our growth policy 5 years ago, we found that not only the younger generation was looking for this, but the seniors. were also looking to downsize and looking to something that had less maintenance and was more walkable. So, you know, that's what we found in all of our outreach with the growth policy. So I think it is, you know, pretty wide ranging for people who are looking for a new kind of experience. Anyway, sorry to
Yep.
interrupt.
No, thank you. Thank you both.
Okay.
Thanks. I love this plan. I'm so excited. My question is, Jason, you said one of the comments was, now we need to take this plan and turn it into law. And I want you to just talk a little bit more about that, because I agree, we can have a plan. What we ultimately see there probably will not be exactly what we see with this plan. The private market comes in and people make choices. We can put in the form-based zoning, but how do we, I don't want this plan to sit on the shelf. So what other things are we going to have to tackle as a city council? And I'm looking at, for example, the park scenario that you set up, and do we tighten up our park structure discussion so that, yeah, we take that in lieu and we put it towards a neighborhood park? And also the streets, how are we going to get the streets that we're seeing in this picture right here? What's on us to take this over the finish line?
Really good question. Yeah. So what we're talking about today is zoning and land development regulations, and they are very crude instruments, you know, to in terms of creating choice-worthy, livable, equitable places. You know, we're doing our best with tools that were developed 100 years ago, really, and we're also in the United States. This isn't France, or England. So. Free market and liberty. And so those very crude tools we have are also very much bounded by our constitutional law. So what we have to do, just as you're asking, is we've got to supplement that. So we've got the crude tool of open space requirements. We can require open space, but we need more. We need to work with the Parks Department in order so that way it's not just the larger parcels. It's also the smaller pocket parks that are hard to maintain, but that people like and they use much more. So there's changes that need to be made to, like, say, the parks plan, you know. And as you said, in streets, in order to, you know, streets are right now handled by engineers, and engineers are you just don't want engineers designing things. And you really don't want them designing streets, is my personal experience. Otherwise they do one thing, they do that well at the exclusion of other things. What we need to do is as the engineers, God bless them, and Rob on this call, one of my favorite people in the world, he's an engineer. We need to make sure that the engineers allow these streets to be multimodal as they come up with their guidelines, which means they have to have a spot for pedestrians, cyclists, and for bikes. So we need to work with them on their plans so that their plans reflect this also. And then affordable housing, you know, you've got an affordable housing plan, and we'll put it together, and you've got a climate adaptation plan. We have done our best to take what we've learned from those plans and put it into the vision, but they are not yet enough in the code. As a council, we need to do more in order to require affordable housing here and require green infrastructure and renewable energy. And you know, there's only so much I can do. That is gonna involve other people like Tom and Andrew and Laval working with affordable housing advocates, working with people who really understand your sustainability question. So yeah, this is just the foundation of the house, and there's a bunch more that needs to be added, specifically parks, housing, streets, and parks, housing, streets.
Transit,
and,
maybe?
That's right. Then there's another big one, it's transit. Unless this is an area connected by transit, It just has to be an area connected by transit. It has to be premium transit. It's got to go back and forth, often. Otherwise, it won't feel like a downtown neighborhood. It won't function like one. If everyone drives, everyone has to drive, from this area to your downtown, it exasperates the problems on Mullen and on Reserve Street. So yeah, absolutely, Tom. So, that's the thing. This is only the beginning, and I feel too bad, but that's the reality, is that it's going to take more plans and more people in order to make just that image there on the left happen.
Thanks.
I'm going to add in too some new information from last night, and one of it was that what you'll see in the plan is that the planning board recommends that we set up an implementation committee of some type. So you will see that, and that will help with all of those things that Jason just listed.
That's great news. Yeah. Turn the approval group into an implementation group, work out the nuance that Rob and I have done our best. Absolutely. Thank you for doing that.
Okay. Gwen, are you good, or do you have a follow-up or anything?
No, that was great. And as you were talking before you said it, I was thinking, so really we just need to set people's expectations and communicate. This is the first step, this plan. And we have a lot more steps ahead of us if we're serious about this. This is not the end. This is the beginning. So thanks for all of that. I think it is really great to flesh that out, that this is going to take a heavy lift, but it's like we saw with the master downtown plan. And then you take 10 or 15 years and you really work on it and you get a lot done, but this is the beginning.
Yeah, well said.
Mirta?
Thank you. I think Gwen's question and your answer, Jason, covered a lot of what I was going to ask. But I also wanted to, first of all, I just want to say I'm so excited and impressed with all the work that you all have done. I have been geeking out on all this stuff that you have been putting out for the community since the beginning. And as a planner, I remember being told in school, zoning is the DNA, is the backbone of how communities develop. And so to have before us a template for how we can do form-based code, which I think it's a much better way to address the reality that we live in today, is really, I'm really grateful for that. And I guess my question is, do you think that in developing this draft that you have included all the ingredients, all the components that could then be replicated for the rest of Missoula? Because I'm wondering how that transition will happen. If it happens, if we all agree that this is working great in this area, how do we then extend that to the rest of Missoula so that as a community we have cohesive development and not just something great that's happening in this area, while we still have the very segregated type of zoning in the rest of the community?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is state-of-the-art form-based coding. Our firm for 33 years has been doing this. We wrote the first form-based code in California, the first one in Florida. We created the Form-Based Code Institute, and we're signers of the Congress for Urbanism. So I can confidently say this is really as good as anything out there. And Rob and I are speaking all the time, and we've got 5 different projects in different parts of the country. And this is good. This does have the pieces. Now, how applicable is this to elsewhere in your part of the world? If you want to build higher densities, compact, walkable urbanism, if you want to build densely, this is, yes, you can take these pieces and you can apply them elsewhere. But you only want to do that sometimes. Other times, as you update your county code or your city code, you're going to want to build in a different way, and you're going to want to preserve views. You're going to want to lower densities. You're going to want to hide structures. You're going to want to keep stuff away from natural stuff. So whenever you want to build big and build a city, the mini city, this code absolutely can help you. And we've been talking to county planners and city planners, and you've got great staff, so I think this is going to help on other projects in other places, but only, again, when you're going to concentrate development. You've got all kinds of other kinds of stuff, situations that you need to figure out, especially in the county, that this will not help you with.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions before we move on? All right. Oh, Heidi.
Sorry, I was made host temporarily and now I can't raise my hand. So I do have a question, I guess, more broadly. Do you have any other communities where, I guess, just a part of town implemented form-based zone like we're doing? And I guess I have some questions about how to achieve equity and policies around, like, for example, affordable housing. And how to make those uniform with two very different base zoning codes.
Yeah. So to the first question, it's usually a part of town, a smaller area that adopts these codes first. And half of our work is with development community. So for instance, Rob and I are working in Las Cruces, New Mexico for a developer, 800 acres. Only those 800 acres will get form-based coding. Or working for a developer outside of Miami on 2,400 acres. Only that area will get the form-based coding. And so it's not uncommon that it's very focused to one area. And that's okay and quite normal. The affordable housing is the big question here, I think, because that's one of the primary purposes of this project. Now, we've done as best we can when it comes to supply. If you just build more, you can, for a while, stabilize prices. That's the market rate solution to affordable housing. There's also a whole variety of unit types allowed and encouraged, like we were talking about, the missing middle. It's not just single family houses on big lots and apartments. There's triplexes and duplexes and row houses and townhomes. There's all variety of affordable. Every single time a dwelling unit shares a wall, the cost of production and the cost of purchasing goes down. So we've worked that angle also, the wider variety of building types. Now, we've done everything, all the market rate solutions. The other thing is is sort of the public sector solutions. We need to involve the housing authority, and we wish the housing authority or a nonprofit housing group could take a piece of this and build it, because they build permanently. They build affordability permanently, deed restricted. I hope that new market tax credits or affordable income tax credits can be applied to this, or Section 8 or Section 5 vouchers, because those make the units permanently affordable also. And our plan talks about that. Our plan talks very much about your affordable housing plan and its goals. So now what we need to do is bring those people into this conversation in order to create permanent, publicly subsidized affordability. Because right now, the best that we can manage was a kind of temporary market rate affordability.
Okay, thanks. Heather?
Thanks, Jordan. Along those lines, Jason, I am one of those at the table, along with Heidi West, that represents nonprofits that are involved in building housing that is affordable. And I think one of the things that people have in their mind are the Cabrini Greens of the Chicago area, where that we should have affordable housing in just one neighborhood, if you will. And I think a lot of folks that we've come to realize that that is not a good formula. So how does this form-based code create more of an interdependency, if you will, between market rate as well as permanently affordable housing? And what are the pros and the cons of that?
Yeah, that's right. So affordable housing for a long time in our country was like Cabrini Greens. It's basically, you know, one spot, tallest towers, surrounded by parking, and that has created pockets of concentrations of poverty and lack of opportunity. It's also hard to get permitted because the neighbors will always fight that, caring about their property values, understandably. So the new way of affordable housing is the mix, right? So that way it's single family houses that sell for $300,000 next to ones that sell for 500, next to ones that sell for 120. It's a mix of housing types for a mix of incomes. This code allows for that, you know, in a way the old zoning didn't. The old zoning said pod of single family, everyone's 5,000 square foot lots, pod of 10,000 square foot lots, you know, pod of 1 acre. This allows the mix, and the mix is actually something developers are more keen to do anyway. I think what we need to do is there should be a forum with affordable housing providers and big landowners like the Dohertys, you know, who own a lot of this property, because I think a conversation about how affordable housing built by a nonprofit provider on these lots on land that is either donated or discounted is really the next step. And we haven't been able to have that conversation. There are places that you'll find in this code where we've already made the situation easier. You know, this was all zoned for large lot ranches. And now we've got a lot of public sentiment in the direction of a walkable mixed use community with smaller units. We've already cleared the major hurdle. The neighbors are okay with this idea. That's, I always think, the biggest one. The next one is, let's have conversations with the landowners about affordability and picking the spot on the, you know, once this plan is adopted, pick your spot and talk to the landowner about how we can build affordably.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Let's go ahead and move on to the next section.
Great. So my name is Rob Pietkowski, working closely with Jason and the rest of the team on developing the plan and the form-based code. And so now we'll get into some of the nitty gritty and technical details of what the draft form-based code is for this area and how it works. So it can be a little complicated at times, you know, when taking an initial look at it. So feel free to ask, questions at any time. So why, again, is a form-based code good for the Mullan area? For a lot of reasons. I think the most important is that it brings together all the elements of development and design that are typically found in different parts of your building code or your zoning code or your subdivision regulations or your street design codes, and kind of brings it all together. It takes all the pieces that are involved in making a place what it is and envisions them together. So buildings, streets, and parks. It allows for a mix of uses, and it allows for a mix of incomes through a variety of different housing types. And we'll get into a little more detail of that. And why this is important? So it can reduce the number and length of car trips by mixing uses. Hopefully some trips can be made by shorter drives or by walking or biking. Maybe it won't be all, but at least some, more than it would be if you do more of the traditional pattern where all houses are in one location, all apartments are in another, and all commercial is in another location. It makes walking, biking safe and comfortable and convenient because we include not just the design of, or not just the design of the private space in terms of what the houses or buildings can be like, but also the design of the public space, most importantly, the streets, which make up anywhere from 25 to 30% of an entire neighborhood. It allows for more affordable housing types. For instance, accessory dwelling units are permitted in the form-based code everywhere. As Jason mentioned, smaller homes, cottages, bigger homes, townhouses, and so on. And it's tailored to the vision. And so there's basically 5 main elements of the form-based code. The regulating plan, which essentially shows where the different zones that we talked about, the transect zones, can go. Public standards, this relates to things in terms of sidewalk, street design, on-street parking, parks. Building standards, how far or close to the street edge buildings need to go, what their interface should be like, the front of a building, how that should relate to the street. Includes an administration section, and it includes some definitions. So this code is intended to be a standalone document to replace Title 20 of the city's zoning code for this one particular area. The same code will apply in both the county and the city. It makes use of the existing subdivision process and the state law that shapes that. And it incorporates some of the development regulations into a single document for the Mullan area. And if we look at the right side of the screen, this is just the overall overview table of contents. So we can quickly see it includes some general provisions. We'll go into the neighborhoods. That's essentially for this area, since it's so large and we want to allow flexibility for property owners, we're regulating at the scale of the neighborhood as opposed to individual lots. Then we go into the transect standards, which is what Jason talked about, the T1, T2, T3, T4, and so on. Then we include general development standards, parking, lighting, utilities, stormwater, lot standards and building standards, thoroughfare standards, and then the development review process. So about the code, it allows for flexibility by permitting a wide range of building types and uses within a same area. We also provide a variety of street types and lower parking requirements. Promotes the creation of housing by increasing the density and requires a mix of building types, not just allows them. For each of the different zones, they'll be required to have 3 different building types. So you can't have one whole area of just large houses or one whole area of just apartments. It has to be a mix, whether that's townhomes, small homes, large homes, mixed use buildings or apartments. That will be left up to the property owner. And it requires walkable neighborhoods. We do that by controlling block size. By putting a cap or a maximum on the block size, it ensures that we don't have really large super blocks. And so we get a lot of smaller or medium-sized blocks, which are more conducive to walking and biking and create an interconnected street network. Buildings are located close to the sidewalk. The location of parking is controlled. It should be behind the buildings or otherwise hidden in a sense from the right of way. So you're not going to be getting essentially long views of parking or long blank expanses of parking. The parking's still there, but its location is more carefully considered, and an emphasis on the frontage of a building. Not the architectural style, but making sure that there's front doors facing the street or that buildings have entrances on the main street and windows so you can have some sort of transparency and eyes on the street, as Jane Jacobs said. So the vision, this is the illustrative plan that came out of the Charrette. And so to take this and to bring it towards implementation, we've created the zoning or the regulations. So the main part of the code is the neighborhood unit type. And this is the main regulating feature of this form-based code. So each of these different colors, so I can get my, I can't. Each of these different colors, the orange, the blue, the beige, the gray, and the green actually will be removed from this based on comments from the airport, represents what we're calling a neighborhood unit type. So from the town center, which is the most dense and intense, greatest mix of uses, greatest allowable density, to the community center, the crossroads center, and then the workplace, which would be a special type of neighborhood, allowing for larger buildings and for some industrial uses, making use of its proximity to the international airport. So when the code would be adopted, this would be what gets initially mapped for the zoning. So this aligns with existing parcels and property lines and sets up the framework in which a property owner can go through the approvals process. And for each of these different neighborhood types, there's different standards. So let's take a look at the town center. So
Hey, stop you for a moment, Rob, for a couple of questions.
sure.
I have Heather first and then Heidi.
Rob, could you go to the screen right before, or the slide right before this one, please? And this question may come up later in your presentation, but when I'm looking at that 200-foot buffer along both sides of Grant Creek, is a kind of a good practice to actually create a public space along that buffer and be able to leverage the natural beauty of a creek and make that accessible to the public like they do in Denver?
Yeah, that would be the ideal outcome. So what this code does is it requires a certain percentage of open space based on state law, but it's difficult to pick which areas are to be the open space in terms of the zoning. Just to avoid zoning away someone's property rights, it's hard to say this particular area has to be a park. So this is one of the really important conversations that we'll need to continue through the implementation committee in terms of how do they leverage the 11% required open space and some of the incentives that we've included for a larger amount of open space. How do they leverage that along with any resources the Parks Department may have towards acquiring park space to make sure that that gets located in areas such as along the creek or within the flight path and similar areas. So the buffer essentially will limit or prevent development within those areas. And most likely that is going to be where the developer would put their park space, and since they can't build there anyway. But it's difficult to say, to just draw this as a park on the official zoning map.
Copy that. Thanks for the explanation.
Heidi?
So my question's around, I guess, future like urban agricultural use. I feel like that's come up a few times, and there were slides in the last presentation that kind of highlighted a component of urban agriculture in this zoning, and I don't see an area that's specifically set aside yet or calls that out. And can you address that?
Right. So in the next iteration, you'll see that this, based on comments we received since our draft, that this parcel that's already under a conservation easement will be called out as a specific place for urban agriculture. But much like the parks issue, this is one where the code, as we go into a little more detail in the coming up slides, will allow for and require certain percentages of open space and agriculture and ways to address them. But it's difficult at this scale to require a particular property owner to put a park in a certain location. So a lot of these things the code will require, but it doesn't pinpoint exact locations. And so that will have to occur during the subdivision review process, like it does today. So there's still a lot of work to be done moving forward. And once if this code is adopted, it doesn't mean that that's the end. There still needs to make sure that through the follow-up process of implementing individual developments, that parks get located in the best place as well as the agricultural uses. So as we go forward, I'll talk about some of the incentives we have for increasing the amount of agricultural space. But again, it's going to come down to the specific locations on individual properties when they come to be developed.
Okay. Thanks.
And a lot of this is working within the Montana subdivision law, which is pretty strict in terms of what we can and can't do through the zoning code. But these are all really good questions. Okay. So each of those different neighborhood types is then required to meet this mix of allocation of transect zones. So as Jason talked about earlier, the transect zones are kind of, whether it's mostly single family or town center or some in between. And so this is where the code offers flexibility. So while you parcel or property maybe within the town center or community center, individual property owner can then apply this mix of transect zones within their particular parcel. So if someone has, say, 100 acres that they're looking to develop through this code and it's in the town center, that means they can have 5 to 30%, 5 to 30 acres can be the edge, 30 to 60 acres can be a mix of the T4, which is the general zone. And we'll go into a little more detail about what these zones actually mean. And 10 to 50 acres of the mixed use center. And there'll also be the 11% required open space. Initially our goal was to increase that, to essentially double the amount of open space required, but we're running into issues with subdivision law in terms of, so we're keeping it at the required 11%, but we've added in some incentives to hopefully bring those numbers up. And so if the same would apply if your property was located in the workplace or the crossroads center. You would then have to apply in your property the mix of transect zones when you're creating your block and street network. You essentially apply a finer level of zoning to your parcel. And so what these different transect zones refer to are open space, T2, T3, or T4, or T5, are essentially different mixes of uses and intensities. So the open space is just what it sounds like, could be agriculture, but most likely just natural lands. The T2 is really large lot, maybe 20, 40 acre homes, or more likely agriculture, whether it's grazing, community supported agriculture, or some other sort of peri-urban farming. The T3 is kind of a standard traditional suburban neighborhood in some ways, with mostly single family homes on somewhat larger lots, but still street oriented, brought up to the front, parking hidden from view or relegated to the rear or side, still allowing for a mix of housing types and sizes, not all one size lot, can be smaller cottages. And then as we move to the T4, buildings become a little more urban, they become closer to the street, they can get a little taller. The widest variety of building types are allowed: cottages, townhomes, duplexes, quadplexes, small apartment buildings, small mixed-use buildings, and so on. And then the T5 is kind of for the neighborhood or town centers. Apartments are allowed here, row houses, various sized of mixed-use buildings, whether it's just a smaller 2-story one to something a little bigger, 4 or 5 stories. And then the special district near the airport has the broadest flexibility in terms of design for building types, allowing for light industrial or manufacturing type of uses, office space or larger office spaces, and other sorts of facilities that could really benefit from being next to the airport. And so these are the more specific zoning that the property owner and developer applies in accordance to this table. So their properties in the town center, and then they divide it up as they look into their preliminary plat, essentially, with blocks and streets, and they allocate the mix of these zones according to this chart. And each of those zones has the key standards. So this includes things, min and maximum densities, build-to zones or setbacks, building heights, and lot coverages. So this table is probably one of the most important and really summarizes everything that's permitted by the code. You can see that there's, the minimum and maximum densities are much higher than what's there today. The setback zones for how far a building should be from the front street, the rear or interior lot lines, lot and block standards, minimum and maximum lot dimensions, as well as building heights, ground floor heights, and special emphasis on parking location, how far setback that has to be from the street, and different types of frontages. So as we talked about earlier, this code doesn't get too much into style or architectural styles, but really overall form of buildings. And in terms of that, frontages are really important, whether it's requiring a porch or stoops or balconies or things like that. And one last thing before we kind of move into a little finer level detail, you may have noticed on this regulating plan map, this kind of dashed outline. So this is the Missoula International Airport extended approach and departure area overlay zone that they have created in their master plans. And it's based on their analysis of where crashes would be most likely to occur, as well as incorporating things like the noise contour. And they have their recommendations for what should and shouldn't occur within this area. Generally speaking, it's a location where people should not congregate. So no schools should be in there, no hospitals, no places of worship or apartment buildings. And its best its best use would be agriculture and open space. But we recognize that there's a need for some development to occur here. So we do permit development. So within this area, the development is limited to 4 dwelling units per acre, just to reduce the intensity in development. And then we have some incentives that I'll go through to encourage more open space instead.
Okay. We have a question from Heather.
Sure.
Thanks. Rob, this particular Monday night, the council approved some changes to our ADU regulations. And I know that's Title 20, and we're talking about moving to form-based code. But can you talk to how a form like an ADU fits within the transit?
Sure. So accessory dwelling units are permitted in most of the transect zones, T3, T4, T4R, and T5. So any one of those could have an accessory dwelling unit by right. And where they would be located would depend on the setbacks. So they would have to fit within the same buildable area that could your primary house could fit in. But we do not specify much more in terms we can pull up that page of the code actually and take a look. But we do talk about minimum and maximum sizes for accessory dwelling units, but we allow them in the code either attached or detached.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Can you talk a little bit about the airport? I mean, there's a tension here where, the airport is always going to request, absolutely no development within that area. I think it's our job as policymakers here to weigh that alongside our need for housing, and I mean the airport in the airport area is certainly a consideration, and there are many considerations. And can you talk a little bit about that tension and how you arrived at the 4 units per acre?
Sure. So when we're looking at this, essentially this dark green area is property owned by the airport, and it's essentially unbuildable. And then for the rest of it, we've had a lot of conversations with the airport, and really their 2 main concerns are housing related to noise issues and concerns, and then parks and open space and Grant Creek related to wildlife and birds, really trying to limit any type of area that can attract lots of birds to hopefully avoid bird strikes for safer flight operations. So we looked through a lot of the previous planning done by the airport, and they can only make recommendations for what occurs in this area outside of their property and outside of their the areas that are controlled by them. And so their ideal recommendation would be no housing whatsoever. And if there is some out here, to keep it lower density, around 2 dwelling units per acre or so. And other uses could be some industrial types of uses. But on the other hand, there's already a lot of development that's either has already occurred within this area or is going through the approval process outside of this zoning and planning effort, and that's most likely to be approved. Especially in this area, the Remington Flats and so on, of a much higher density than what we're showing. So the 4 dwelling units per acre was kind of a compromise that we've come to. The airport cannot, specifically support any development in this area, so they're not going to give us their approval. They have to advocate for what they need is best for themselves. So we selected 4 based on allowing for some sorts of residential development within the area, and not removing the amount of, not to reduce the amount that property owners can develop today. And also by allowing a mix of uses, we're hopeful that developers or property owners would locate some of the more commercial or non-residential uses within this area.
Okay, I appreciate that. I wanted to highlight that just what you said, that the airport is going to always be in a position of not wanting anything in this area, and that is a perfectly reasonable position for them to advocate for as an airport. And I think what we need to do is just be mindful of that concern, and also of the competing tensions around housing and everything else. So thanks for the background on that. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Okay. And so for each of the different transect zones, there's pages that look like this, which outline the different regulations shown on the summary chart, but for that specific zone, as well as some diagrams explaining how those relate. So we have setbacks, front setbacks, side setbacks, rear setbacks, frontage build out, which is something that's not typical in your in a typical zoning regulation. And this really helps to encourage buildings to be closer to the street and to have a front that creates the type of public realm envisioned by the code. Basically, if we're looking at this, the frontage build out on the front street says 80% minimum. That means that 80% of your lot needs to have some sort of building frontage within the build to zone on that lot. And these numbers will vary and become less intense as we move from T5 down intensity to T4 and T3. Lot and block standards, building forms, maximum heights, ground floor, ceiling heights, permitted uses, permitted frontage types, parking location, and where encroachments can occur. So when you go through the code, you can look through each one of these pages in more detail. And so those are the main aspects of how the code is proposing to regulate development, from the largest scale of the neighborhood unit, which gets adopted, and then the rest would go through the process of a property owner looking to develop it would then allocate the mix of transect zones according to the mix that they're permitted based on the neighborhood unit type. And then within each one of those transect zones, you have the flexibility to work within these requirements. So each of these different transect zones is still fairly broad and much different than a traditional Euclidean zoning district, because you still allow for a mix of uses. Even if something's designated T5, it doesn't mean it's all apartment or all mixed use. And it allows for apartments and mixed use and townhouses. What's mainly controlled is how far from the street edge those have to be, and how much of the lot can be covered and how tall they are. And the same thing for T4 and T3 and T2. It's just that the intensity becomes lower and more residential, essentially. And uses are still important. And so this includes, the code does include a use table, which is somewhat simplified from typical zoning use tables to make sure that we keep it open to flexibility. So each of the different transect zones has its own permitted and uses that can be approved by warrant, which is explained in the administration portion of the code. And so you could see that for residential, we include a series of residential types, from mixed use, apartment buildings, live work, live make, townhouse, duplex, and a variety of others. And so each, as I mentioned, each one of these transect zones would be required to have 3 of those residential housing types per development. And that's really to make sure that a developer can't build all townhouses or all small houses or all big houses, that it really has to be a mix of housing types. And that's part of the market rate solution for encouraging missing middle housing and more affordable housing types.
Great, thanks. Ellen, you want to add something?
Yeah, I had to unmute, sorry. I'm never fast at that. Rob, why don't you, for purposes of this discussion, go ahead and do a brief explanation of what approved by warrant means, rather than waiting until we get to the administration section at the end, because that may be important.
Sure. So essentially, this code has its own administration section where we outline what a permitted use is, what a by warrant is, and the exceptions. So warrants are things that can be allowed through administrative approval if they meet the intent of the code, and that would be something that can be approved by staff, by the planning and zoning staff. Much like a lot of how this code would be administered is very similar to how the design overlay is administered through intent. And let me see. Oops. 1 second.
Just to follow up on that, we tried to make what the public wants to see easy and approved administratively. And what they do not want to see, either not allowed at all or approved by warrant, which has the ability, the city or county could put conditions on that. They can haggle a bit. So for instance, gas stations are allowed in the special district, but it's only by warrant. So the gas station would be subject to the form controls. The building would have to be in the front, the pumps in the back, in order to create an urban gas station, that kind of thing.
Great, thanks.
Great, thanks, Jason.
Are there any questions before we move on? Heidi?
Yeah, so I have a question on, I guess that residential, or wait, what's it, the heading, lodging? I guess just around definitions, because tourist homes aren't specifically called out. And I'm wondering if they should be, or if they're somehow covered by these other labels of, like, I don't know, bed and breakfast, or how those relate to each other.
So that's a good question. How we've addressed that at the moment is had them just with allowing them to be permitted within the MULLAN area where they're lawfully established dwelling unit. And they have to, we're still referencing, in this case, Title 20, a specific section for Title 20 to ensure that where any one of these residential units could be a tourist home as long as it meets those requirements.
And then I have a second question around what was, just because I don't know, what's the label C designate? Is that a commercial?
Sorry, that's civic. So that's kind of a very special transect. It's not required anywhere. And this is something where if the city wishes to build a school in the area, they can work with the property owner and with the civic designation, and then essentially they have quite a bit of flexibility as civic uses public uses don't have to follow specific zoning standards in Montana.
And I guess my only comment about that is that
Mhm.
child care, sorry, the slide's really small,
Okay.
that maybe I could see a role of having civic buildings or institutions and childcare. So I think it
Okay.
should be allowed.
Sure.
That's what I'm
That
saying.
makes that makes
Thank
sense.
you.
Great, thanks. Dave?
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. So question for Rob. It's actually a couple of questions, but they're really interrelated. And so this deals with the idea of multiple property owners owning land within a particular neighborhood unit, or in the case of building, within, let's say an approved subdivision, if there are, again, multiple property owners. So within a neighborhood unit, there's a certain mix of uses that are required, that's required within the particular kind of larger neighborhood. And so what happens if a developer comes in and wants to build a particular type of product that is allowed and in fact required within that unit? But then another developer comes in later and wants to build, like, are they responsible for kind of, how to say it, for building the other types that are required that the first developer didn't? Or how do multiple property owners work together, I guess? And so similarly, in a subdivision development, if a purchaser wants to buy 3 lots out of a 20 lot subdivision and builds a particular type of product that's allowed or required within that, do the other purchasers of the remaining lots have to kind of fill in the gap and build other types of units that are required?
Right. So to answer your first question, the percentages in that chart are all for individual applicant master site plan. We go into so that means for each development, they have to meet those requirements. So it's not for the neighborhood as a whole. It would be, I want to develop my 20 acres. I need to have this mix on my 20 acres. So each development is not dependent on another one. It's all internal to that particular development. To answer your second question, it'll come down to once a developer goes through this process and gets their transect zones approved, then they'll be able to sell individual lots once they go through the final site plan and final subdivision. And once it goes through that process, it'll have a transect zone zoning, which allows for a certain number of housing types. And so, the code doesn't specifically say which lot needs to be what, and I think that will have to occur during the master site plan and final site plan, which we'll talk about in a little bit, processes whereby they establish essentially the development program for their development. So within that development program, they'll have to list out what types of residential uses and building types they're going to have and how many. And so that'll kind of be the time for figuring out how many townhouses it will be, how many mixed-use residential buildings it would be, how many duplex residential units it would be, and cottage and house and so on for that particular project. And so essentially when a lot is sold off, it would already have what type of product should be located on it, or at least in general. Jason?
Well, just exactly that. So it is the case that a developer might find themselves saying, all right, well, I sold all my single family. Now I've got to sell my multifamily, I've sold all of my multifamily, which are townhomes. I've got to sell my multifamily, which are rental apartments. And so that it does make it trickier. Talking with some of the home builders and the realtors, that's not something they're used to at this point. However, really, it's the only way you can keep it from becoming just one housing type throughout the whole of the 2,000 acres.
Okay, thanks. Ellen, did you want to add something to that? Ellen or Dave?
Basically, I have a question. Do you guys find that in other areas where form-based codes similar to this have been instituted, does it cause property owners to start talking to each other? You may have somebody who's ready to develop 20 acres, and there may be 20 acres adjacent, and they're not quite ready to develop, but does it cause that kind of cooperation and interaction that we don't see today at all, necessarily?
Just really quick, yeah. So the plan itself will be like the master developer. And very shortly, Rob will show a map of streets and transects. So it'll, as a practical matter, it'll feel like there's one owner of all 2,000 acres, and that owner has a vision. And smaller developers will then take pieces from that, and they will build those pieces. And just as you're saying, Ellen, certain things will be coordinated right from the beginning. The streets will connect, the green spaces will connect, the way the water is handled will connect. And so in one way, they don't have to communicate so much because the connections between the properties are already there. In another way, I feel like there's going to be certain amenities they're going to want to bring that will involve discussion. And here's the thing, they won't be in competition with each other. They won't be trying to, as often happens in land development, push, their competitors to the edges, because the larger plan will already be there. And in my experience, and we've got projects here that, I'm talking to 30 different developers, they're working more congenially because there's no way that it's no longer a winner take all environment because the big decisions have already been made.
Okay, thanks. Dave or Ellen, do either of you have additional questions?
I'm good.
No, just a comment. It's just going to take some learning, I think. It sounds like it's quite a bit more intensive in terms of administration, but that's not to say it's a bad idea or a bad product. I think we're just gonna have to learn.
Yeah, a lot of new stuff here. Heather.
For all good things.
Absolutely. They are all good things. What I think we've spoken to this a little bit, but as I think about the fact that there are not so many large pieces of land for development, and I know there are a few like the MULLAN area, but I think if we want to try and encourage the developers that come before us now, before we even get to passing this form-based code, how do we try and transition the market, if you will, to embracing this form-based code now on a smaller scale?
Right. So, within the MULLAN area, there are quite a bit of projects, already going through approvals process. This code will allow them, in many cases, a much greater amount of density and development types. So that is quite a big advantage. The disadvantage would be that it is something new for a lot of the local developers. And so, we've been working closely with Tom and Andrew, meeting with them and trying to help explain how the code works, and just to show how it offers more flexibility. So I think those are the two key things, is that it may ask a little more in terms of design and quality and urbanism, but it's giving a lot more in terms of permitted density and intensity, as well as flexibility. Typically, if you just have your normal zoning code, you have one particular zone, you're required to build a certain, essentially, type of product. In other cases, they've gone through the sawmill district, and they got very specific in terms of the code and what was approved for that. And so whenever there needs to be a change, it can be really onerous and really essentially kind of difficult to make revisions to that plan. These things might take a decade or more to build out. And so markets will change. Developers may want to switch from one housing type to another or one use to another. And so this code allows for all those types of changes without having to do a rezoning or something like that. Because once you have mapped out your different transect zones, your T1, T2, T3, 4, and 5, and so on, within each one of those, there's still a lot of flexibility. If you have a lot that's T4, and maybe when you first did this, you thought, I'll put a townhouse here. And then 3 years later, when you're going to build, things are changed. And so maybe you want to put a small single family house there, or a duplex there, or combine a few of those T4s and put an apartment there. And so those are all things that would be permitted under the zoning. You may need to do other changes in terms of combining lots, but nonetheless, the zoning still would allow for that. And so I think those are the things to make that really help this code in the long term as a benefit for those looking to develop, is the flexibility it provides and the increase in density.
Thanks.
Great, thanks. Okay, I think we can go ahead and move on. And just as a time check, we are about 75% of the way through our meeting. We've got a half hour left.
These are great questions, so feel free to keep them coming. We also in the code include lot and building standards, and this regulates the interface between public space and the building private space. So relationship of buildings to other buildings, requiring fronts of buildings to face other fronts of buildings or sides of buildings, and prohibiting backs of buildings from facing fronts of buildings. And these are things that would have to be approved when the master site plan process is underway. Shop front standards, frontage design, and accessibility standards. And we've also included quite a bit for green buildings. So offering incentives for constructing green buildings, permitting solar and geothermal by right, and allowing larger scale renewable energy production across a lot of the different zones, especially in conjunction with continued agricultural use, or as a property waits to be developed, it can be put towards other purposes. And what's really unique is this code includes 20 different street types. So this is where it kind of takes in pieces from other other titles from Missoula's current development regulations. And so these are all, each of these different street types is allowed throughout the MULLAN area based on what transect it's adjacent to. And the location and type of street to be used is left to each individual developer. So if you have an area that you're developing and it's surrounded by T3, you can pick one of the street types that corresponds to T3. And similarly with the T4 and T5. And as you look through the code, you'll see that there are sample typical street sections for each of those different street types, along with charts with right-of-way dimensions, landscape zone dimensions, and green infrastructure that should be or could be incorporated. And so a lot of these offer ranges in terms of how wide the landscape zone should be, or the boulevard. These including streets in the code is one of the most important things in terms of having this plan be successful. It's really, these are going to help with the walkability, with bikeability, with creating places that are also beautiful, and that allow the types of transit service that we're hoping can serve this area in the future. And so the city is moving forward on their own updates to their infrastructure regulations and combining a lot of them into a unified document, which is a really great idea and has a lot of good purpose behind it. But we're hoping that this code can go a step beyond that and require some more specific design standards and specific street sections that really will foster the safe, comfortable, and interesting streets that we talked about throughout this entire process, and that the community through the charrettes and the feedback really are supportive of, and also really are critical towards meeting the region's mode split goals, mode share goals from long range transportation plan. So if you haven't, I recommend taking a look at these. There's, I think, 20 different sections in the code. Some are your typical neighborhood street, others that get a little more different or unique. The bike streets with a cycle track, as well as allowing the WUNARFs. So none of these are required in any specific location, but we want to make sure that we give property owners and developers the tools and pieces necessary to create really great and unique places, and make sure that even the most standard street section is still one that supports walking and biking, and allows driving as well, and accommodates all the different needs.
I think we have a question from Julie.
Yeah, and I'm not actually sure if this is a question for Rob or for Jordan. It seems like over the past couple of years, we have spent a lot of time hearing from developers how they want variances from our street width requirements. It seems to come up often. So I'm wondering if this, the way it's presented here will maybe take some of those requests off the table and just have a little more standardized, if you will, approach to the street widths. And so we don't have to, it seems like a lot of time gets sucked up talking about variances to street widths.
Right, so that's a good question, comment, and we've heard this, this has been brought up to us before. And so, you know, when you're going through development in this area today, there will be requests for variances on the street designs in the existing code and development process. And, you know, once those have been given for one project, it can be difficult or maybe not always legally advisable to not give those same variances to another developer if there's no change in conditions to not warrant it. Our thought and hope is that, you know, if this new code is adopted with these specific street sections, then that kind of starts from a clean slate, that, you know, no variances were given to any of these street sections under this plan because it's new. And so that can hopefully eliminate, you know, at least one part of, you know, a need to have to give a variance. The other hand is there are a lot of different sections to pick from that are tailored to different situations that may occur in for a developer. And so, and each one of the sections has some flexibility built in terms of how wide sidewalks can be or how wide planting areas can be. And so with that flexibility, our hope is that these would be, you know, would not vary too much, and that these would be the sections applied. Of course, there's always the possibility that there's some situation that arises, but in general, these have been designed very carefully with the different types of transect zones and what can occur in each of those. So I think that these would allow the flexibility that would not, so developer wouldn't need to ask for a variance, and also it kind of, like I said, cleans the slate, and so legally you would most likely or hopefully not have to give variances because you've given them in the past, because this is something completely new.
Thanks.
Great, and so in this graphic that we're showing now is called the street atlas. It's an example street atlas, and it shows how all the different street types could be applied to a future build out of the MULLAN of this area. Again, this is just a recommendation, and you know, we're including it as in the plan and the code as a sample to hopefully encourage developers to move in a certain direction, but it's not required. Although we have been working closely with the build grant team to get the build grant streets to meet these standards as well. The code also includes several recommendations. So these relate to things that are important, and the code helps require, but the code helps to recommend where parks and open space should be, but we're somewhat limited in being able to only require a percentage of it. So we've included these diagrams to essentially show where open space should occur, with the hope that developers would look at this and use it as a guide when looking to allocate their open space requirements, as well as locations for possible civic uses. So this is really where the implementation committee and the parks department and property owners would have to work together to identify locations where a park may be best suited, and perhaps multiple property owners can pool their 11% where the properties meet to create the larger parks. Perhaps the school district would be looking to purchase a particular property, and so they can coordinate with the landowners. These are things that we'd like to see and the code encourages, but it doesn't and it cannot require. And we've done the same thing with the transect zones. We've essentially applied them across the entire area as a best practice example of how the code could play out. So if a property owner owns this chunk of land here, they could, when they're going through their development process, they could look at what the plan recommends and use it, or come up with their own design based on the code requirements. But most likely it will be something similar to this. We've got a lot of comments and feedback through the public, through agency review, through the Consolidated Planning Board. And so we've made some changes to the code that you'll see on the website. And these next two slides illustrate all the different concepts, all the different revisions, sorry. I'll just run through some of the major ones. The first one is the airport reserved neighborhood unit type will be removed, and open space requirement will be made 11% and no longer the 22%. And then we've also added in a couple incentives for increasing the amount of open space and agricultural space. So if you increase the amount of open space or agricultural space, you can get essentially a density bonus as well. And also adding in some zero waste provisions, making sure that there's space for recycling and composting, as well as landfill, receptacles and developments and on streets, adding in some more definitions. For example, the airport extended approach departure area zone, allowing the utility scale or larger scale renewable energy generation to be permitted, and so on. And so that's the essence of the code. We also have, can also bring up essentially the development review procedures, which we can go through fairly quickly. But before we do that, does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, it looks like we have a question from Heather.
Thanks. So in regards to the code itself, I've been kind of curious to know why we are looking at using 11% for open space as a requirement. It's an odd number, which catches my eye, but how did we get to that particular number?
So the assumption is that these properties will, that are in the county, will be annexed into the city and will go through a subdivision process to create smaller individual lots and streets. And under Montana state law in the subdivision process, it's 11% that's required for open space. And so that is where the 11% comes from.
So again, we wanted 22%. We wanted to double open space. But Montana state law limits us to 11%. It was decided essentially by a court case. So in order to create more open space, we did things like allowing grazing and utility level solar to happen on the same spot. There's actually quite a bit of money to be made putting in solar generation. And we're hoping that that use, among others, will help more of that land stay preserved, stay low, stay unbuilt. But, I gotta say, the 11% was really unfortunate, but there we are.
Thanks. Mary, do you have something to add to that?
Yes. the current subdivision regulations require 11% when there's a single unit on a parcel and the parcel's under a half acre. But it has a formula that city adopted that requires 20% essentially if more than 2 dwelling units are on a parcel. So it is a reduction in the open space requirement essentially in this form-based code.
Thanks.
Jordan, I have a second question unrelated to what we were just talking about.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I really have to say how much I appreciate, Tom, you sending us that link to Planner's Web and really giving us the opportunity to inform ourselves for today's educational meeting. So my question is, how long is it going to take us to go through the process of transforming our land use zoning to form-based code? What kind of timeline are we looking at?
I'm not sure I understood that. Would you say that again, Heather?
Sure. I assume that the whole point of having this session today is obviously informing and educating us counselors to move us in the direction of converting or transforming from Title 20 zoning to form-based code. And I'm wondering what the timeline is you anticipate this would take.
Okay, okay, so this code would appear in front of City Council on the 7th. And then I think there will be another second hearing, and depending on how many committee meetings that happen, this could be adopted as soon as 30 days after that approval vote. And I'm not sure if you were asking about converting other kinds of zoning to something more like this, or if that was just when this code would be adopted.
More to the latter point that you just made.
Yeah, so and I think Jason could answer this too, and that's that we have a really built out community, and it was done under Euclidean zoning, and so it would be very difficult to convert that to a kind of form-based code. That being said, there are ways to change our zoning and, for instance, allow neighborhood services within some of the strictly residential zones. And that would start to get us there. Just because this takes into account really parks, the public space, the streets, the building forms, the park space, all at one time, it really is almost impossible to convert some existing built out space to a form-based code. I mean, it would all become non-conforming, but I think there are ways, and Jason probably could talk about that you can start to move your code toward something more like this. And, all of it involves adding flexibility somehow, and that's possible. Jason, can you add?
Sure. With the existing codes, yeah, the things that Rob talked about, the most important parts of the code can be added, just as Tom said, to other parts of the code. For instance, you could say, outside of this area and subdivisions going forward, there needs to be at least 3 different unit types. It can't all be single family, it can't all be commercial. Or you could say, like this code says, there needs to be a green space and it needs to be at the center of the community. It can't be on the periphery. It just can't be, the leftovers after the subdivision process. Or you could say every street needs to be a complete street. So there's definitely pieces in this that could be applied to different places. But as Tom said, it would be sort of strategically added to those other codes.
As this one is set up, it's essentially for a greenfield or traditional neighborhood types of development. It would take a slightly different form if it's applied to existing developments. The neighborhood structure probably wouldn't quite exist, and it would the neighborhood unit plan type structure is something unique for a site like this. But there are examples of communities doing this. It's a big undertaking, and it requires looking at all your development regulations as well if you get into, if you really get into it. But this could be applied to other greenfield sites within the area, and that would be more easy than, or it would be easier than coming up with the form-based code for the existing neighborhoods.
So Jordan,
Yeah, go ahead.
a question for you as our chair. Are you kind of envisioning presenting options to our future developers that come before us to either work within Title 20 or to start using the form-based code?
I think it's maybe more of a question for Tom. I think the intent is to adopt that at the same time as the master plan, and maybe an additional question on that, Tom, is sort of how this relates, how the regulating plan map relates to like our growth policy land use map, and how those go back and, or how those are interrelated.
So we are repealing so this area right now is a plan area, and it's the West Y MULLAN plan area. So for the purposes of converting to this plan, which is a neighborhood plan, we are repealing the Y MULLAN for this area and replacing it with this plan. So, and this plan also changes the land use designation in our growth policy to a kind of unique land use designation, which is MULLAN area neighborhood land use, something like that. I'm not sure exactly the name of it, but so the land use in our growth policy is changed to this new special land use designation. The neighborhood units act more like zones, really. They compare more to like a zoning district in the city. However, it's not exactly like that, but it behaves in that way. And I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Okay, thanks. Dale, did you want to add as well?
Yeah, potentially. I think I'm going to, because at the risk of not knowing what I'm talking about, I am going to state this in the form of a question. So the way I understand it, we're going down this path as an amendment to the growth policy, and this is essentially a large neighborhood plan jointly with the county. Most of the undeveloped land that we see here is actually in the county. So when this is adopted, the city, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Laval and Tom, that the city, we aren't actually adopting the zoning as a regulatory document right at the get-go. And that is largely because all of these parcels are currently outside the city limits. County intends to adopt the form-based code in this area, but as these parcels develop and they come into the city, the intent would be the city would adopt that zoning at the time. Isn't that correct?
Yes. So the code would be, so the county will wind up zoning this land with this code and with the regulations. Then as each development comes in, and we've talked about this, and even with you, Dale, that as each development comes in and is annexed, it receives city zoning, which, because we just adopted this code, is identical to what the county had. So it will come in development by development through annexation and receive the same zoning, which, obviously streamlines that process.
So I think maybe if I'm interpreting Heather's question correctly as well, that what happens if someone wishes then to rezone to a district under Title 20? I assume that would be not recommended by staff, but what would that look like if someone wanted. Is that your question, Heather?
Oh, I'm thinking about how do we create more flexibility to get the kind of affordable housing that we need on the market, whether it's from our for-profit, nonprofit, or governmental entities. How do we adapt to our need and be able to have as many tools at our disposal to accomplish those goals? And Title 20, as we know, isn't allowing for that. So how can we be able to use this form-based code for the smaller projects?
Lavelle, I see your hand up. Do you want to take that?
Okay. So, we still do look to the housing policy document as a pretty significant guide for how we help to address the affordability issues in town. And really working in on this MULLAN code is one of those tools. But there are still other recommendations in the housing policy for us to work on. We will be doing that. The idea of the form-based code has its great benefits in places where there is greenfield opportunity, because you really can look at setting the stage appropriately for the mixed use, a lot of things fresh and place-based right from the get-go. What some communities do is hybrids of a combination of regulation and strong visuals to be able to describe that flexibility that we're liking in the MULLAN plan. Taking on an entire city and migrating it to form-based code is a really bigger challenge, and I think that's what we were hearing from Jason also. And we don't know whether that's something that is an ultimate desire here in the city. So I think we need to have some time to look at the tools in our toolbox and keep planning for the innovation and the urgency of the needs we know are out there. But we do have the housing policy as a major guide, and I just want to refer to that. As far as smaller areas go, I don't know. I think we're open to what would be the right way to help a particular area, to create the variety, to support the affordability and other services that we can do, either in an area or an entire city. And we're still exploring those work plan pieces. So I just wanted to try to clarify that. And direct us to some of the other policy work we still are working on. One other thing, I think, just to make it clear when you talk about what we're getting in this particular process, is you are asked to adopt the text of the form-based code now, so that it's ready for when those rezoning requests come in. And then, that's when mapping of an area will occur. So the text will be ready in this new title, not Title 20, but Title 20 something. And we'll have the consistency between the county and the city. And we'll be ready as new proposals come into the city.
Great, appreciate all the comments.
Great. So we have just a couple minutes left. I have Mary, and then we'll go to Heidi.
I was just going to add that so when a property annexes in, because you will have adopted the MULLAN area form-based code, but not applied it to any land, and because that zoning matches the neighborhood plan that you've also adopted for this area, that will be the recommendation of staff at the time of annexation and zoning upon annexation of any proposal coming in.
Okay, thanks. Heidi?
I guess I have one question and then some general comments. And I guess my question kind of revolves around some of these more recent annexations and subdivisions we've seen in this area, which expressly don't meet some of these goals. For example, a recent subdivision that has tons of like garages facing streets and no alley access. Is there a way or a path for developers, maybe that like the new flexibility that this brings to transition and change, these recently approved projects? I guess how do you how is this going to move forward?
So that's.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that. I mean, a developer is if that's what they would like to do, it's possible that they would make the decision. But I think what is probably most likely to be expected is that if they've already invested quite a bit of time in the design and engineering and have already received approvals, it's probably unlikely that they would switch voluntarily unless the market conditions change dramatically or their project gets put on hold for some other purpose. And then they look down the road at rethinking it. Once a project's approved under existing regulations, you can't retroactively require them to follow the new regulations. I think the best hope is to really share with them what the advantages are, how they could perhaps include more development or more density or have more flexibility. But it is a big challenge to retroactively have them change their plans once quite a bit of time and money has gone into what they've come up.
And that makes perfect sense. I'm wondering if there's any way we could create just informationally, like a map that kind of shows developments that are already, I guess, platted, and to the degree to which they meet these broader goals. I think that would be just super interesting and also give a lot of context to the possibility that exists moving forward. And then I just have a general comment. I think a lot of our town, especially the older parts of town, already don't really jive with the zoning districts that exist. And housing types exist in those districts that wouldn't be allowed. I could think of some like lovely fourplexes, for example, in the university district that wouldn't be allowed under current zoning, but they look like single family homes and really fit into the existing neighborhood. And I think that's true for a lot of town, actually. There is that mix match between the built environment and the zoning code. But then there's also a dearth of services. So I would love to see some way moving forward that some of this form-based, I guess, framing extends broader to the rest of Missoula, because I could see it being great on the north side, for example, to get like, neighborhood commercial and get like little coffee shops or get those neighborhood services that people need. And that's also true for, say, the South Hills, where, we have these like historic platted subdivisions that are not now being built out, and they really lack access to, grocery stores even though they're lovely homes. And I guess none of this really addresses non-market rate affordable housing. I think that that's important to underscore. And I guess moving forward, I think there really needs to be a conversation about equity and incentives to create that more intentional, permanent affordable housing, because we need it in all parts of town. It'd be great to have a lot of it here, but a way of creating an incentivizing system that doesn't concentrate, all of the affordable housing here. And I'm saying that from a neighborhood that is carrying the brunt of the affordable housing development at the moment, but I think that, we really need it all over town. So those are just general comments, but I think this is lovely, and I'm super excited about having, a part of town that's really focused on the livability of the space. It's awesome. So thanks.
Thanks, Heidi.
Could I add in, Heidi, to what you were saying, and just let you know that my next project is going to be the review of our growth policy. And so the comments you were making as you are saying them are, you know, the ones I want to hear from you when we take this up. So those are kind of, we have good timing going on here. And so where all that starts is with the growth policy. So if we can get the foundation for these needs there, then we can take up some actions and start to get there. So yeah, I just wanted to add that and the timing.
Just to add one more thing. A lot of times a new community like this, like in the case of Montgomery, Alabama, new community comes in and then the existing city says, hey, we want that too. And then it has an effect and they change regulations. Or in Austin, new community came in called MULLAN and they're like, hey, we need that. And so, you know, they went and they changed the regulations in the existing city. So the one thing that happened in both those cases and in a lot of cases is the regulations change, and that's good and that's necessary. The other thing that happens is just your local builders and your local developers are used to one kind of thing, and there's a lot of inertia. So when good things start to happen, like Old Sawmill District or this, then they start thinking other things and they start making new partners. Maybe all they've done their whole life is they built houses with garages out front, but they start, all of a sudden they start meeting guys who are capable of building townhomes with alleys. And this is going to have a rippling effect on your existing areas, and it's going to have a rippling effect on your new subdivisions. And I know that because I've seen that in so many places, and it would be a good effect.
Thanks, Jason. Mary?
I just had a quick thought about thinking about this form-based code with what we have in Title 20. And we have the opportunity in some areas that are designated for neighborhood mixed use or community mixed use to have those mixed uses. And then the zoning that we have in place would allow for those mixed uses. But what the form-based code is, it actually requires some of the mix. And I think that's a missing element in Title 20, because you can have, you know, a large property, you know, zoned B21, and it could all be developed with multi-dwelling. And so that might be a way to look at Title 20 in changing, you know, requiring sort of a mix in either the residential building types to actually occur, or a mix with some neighborhood commercial with the residential.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. Okay, we are out of time, so I want to, if anyone has any closing thoughts, I want to accommodate those, but I also want to, if anyone needs to leave, please do. And so I guess with that, anyone else have anything else to add on all of this? Okay, just note for the record, there still is no public here for public comment, but I know this has been seen extensively by the public in a number of venues. I want to thank everyone from Dover Coal and from city staff for the really informative presentation and great discussion. I'm really looking forward to the adoption process and wrapping this up. And I think that the presentation today was really great background, and I really appreciate it. So, thanks everyone. With that, we will be adjourned.